Roughly 10 million patients seek emergency care each year in California's emergency departments. Those 10 million patients are treated by just a few thousand emergency physicians and other providers. This is the story of those few thousand emergency physicians who pioneered the practice of emergency medicine. This is the story of emergency physicians fighting for patients without a voice. This is the California Project.
When I was in high school, those of us that wanted to be doctors, when we turned 16 and got our driver's license, several of my friends, like that week, went down. There's a Red Cross training program on Saturday mornings from 9 to 12, 3 hours. They went down and took this 3-hour course and learned how to carry a patient on a gurney and splint. They became ambulance drivers. There were no paramedics. They were ambulance drivers. They were 16 years old. The ambulances in those days, we didn't have ambulances. They were they were all Cadillacs, Cadillac station wagons, basically. And in our area, they were mostly painted silver, not red or anything. And the reason they were silver was because they would have, you remember when Kojak, remember the TV series? Oh, it's all your grandparents told you about. He had this little, when you have to have lights and sirens, he put this little thing, reach up on the top of his car. But they had the same similar thing. And they had this sign on the top of the ambulance with rotating letters. One letter said ambulance. You rotated it and said, Pumphrey's Funeral Home or something. And so it was silver because they could use the same car as both a ambulance and a hearse. And they would come into, to the home there where, Mr. Jones had his heart attack or something, and the ambulance drivers, 16 or 17-year-olds, would give the card, Mr. I'm sorry, we're going to take absolutely good care of your husband. But if he doesn't make it, we want you to know we 2 for the price of 1. Well, what you alluded to is actually right. Vietnam changed that because you had these guys that had been medics in the Army or corpsmen in the Marine Corps that got turned on to the idea of helping people who were acutely traumatized. And they came back from Vietnam, and the concept of a paramedic was established. In addition to that, docs who had been over there in combat, who had been combat surgeons but who weren't necessarily that adequately trained for that, came back and said, I don't want to, just have an office practice. I like this concept of having a critical patient and I can make a difference within a half hour.
The mission of emergency medicine is really unique. We're there for every patient who walks in the door 24 hours a day, no matter whether they're old, young, insured, uninsured, we're always there for them.
Tallest mandate never extended to emergency physicians. Nobody ever made any other doctor work a minute that they didn't want to work in any department in the state or anyplace else.
So I followed the governor to the men's room, and I will never live that down.
And we basically taught ourselves emergency medicine as best we could. Now these young people are getting extraordinary training at the hands of people who are extraordinarily well trained and good teachers.
There have always been ERs, and as I said, they were often staffed by, a gynecologist setting bones. Didn't know anything about that. Or, a retired gynecologist or ENT doc taking care of heart attacks. Nobody wanted to be in the ER. Or a new doc starting out didn't have enough patients and figured they could, recruit patients by working in the ER. And in some places, there was no doctor. The docs, let's say, were in an office building next door, and when someone came in, the nurse would call the doc who was on call for that day and say, we've got such Mrs. Jones here who's got a chest pain or whoever it may be, or we've got little Tommy with a broken arm. And that doc, who might be any specialty, but was on call for the day, would come over at lunchtime and take care of it.
And it occurred to me at the time that the hospital where I had done some training was staffing their emergency, what they call their AR, not their emergency department, their admitting room, with moonlighting itinerant gypsy doctors who were trying to pick up a few extra bucks for their while they were doing their residency.
At that time, basically the only criteria I think you needed to work in an emergency department is you had to have a California license, and then you had to have a BLS card to show that you were proficient in basic CPR.
I went to the Los Angeles affiliate of the American Heart Association. We created pre-hospital standards for cardiovascular care, first time in the nation. Printed a brochure, and that became a standard bearer and a teaching manual.
On one side was where the trucks to the cafeteria pulled up. In the middle was where the trucks for the laundry pulled up. And on the right side was where the ambulances pulled up. We had a room, I think it was like 4 rooms, 4 beds or something, with an unsupervised intern.
ACEP sponsored a resolution that I authored asking the California Medical Association to recognize this as a specialty and write all the other specialties who sat on this conjoint board stating they recognized emergency medicine and we met the definition of a specialty.
The hospitals who wanted to open emergency departments would hire just about anyone with an MD to cover, and that isn't right either. So with a lot of planning and making a lot of mistakes, we finally refined it, and now we have what I think is the most popular specialty in medicine.
As Cal ACEP leaders fought on both the state and federal levels to establish emergency medicine as a recognized specialty, they also worked tirelessly to implement equitable standards for their practices, but also for first responders and Good Samaritans.
What would happen is that if you had an alleged malpractice event in the emergency department, the plaintiff's attorney would find some specialist that, say OBGYN, who did a little bit of practice in the ER, but basically had their practice outside. And they would go before a jury and they said, had I been in the emergency department, here's what I would have done as far as taking care of this patient. So it was an unfair standard. You had a specialist in OBGYN or neurology or orthopedic surgery giving the standard of practice that an emergency physician who had to know all of these areas of practice, which led to the Cal ACEP legislation that said only another emergency physician with substantial actual practice in the ER while assigned to be in the ER could be an expert witness against that physician. We loaded the bill up with a bunch of public health provisions. For the first time in law, which is still in law today, we advanced the idea that a Good Samaritan in a roadside incident or whatever the situation would be held free from any negligence for their Good Samaritan actions. The second element in the bill was to provide that local governments and other nonprofits that provided training in CPR would be held to a standard of gross negligence. And then we had the same standard for paramedics as well, so that they'd have some freedom to act and not, have oppressive malpractice incidents against them. And then at the last of the bill, we had a standard of gross negligence for emergency physicians in the ER. And so the bill went in that way, and it was assigned to the Health Committee. And, we got a lot of public agencies to support. And so we had a long series of negotiations, and we came up with a standard instead of the gross negligence standard I mentioned a minute ago, a standard of having only another emergency physician as being the expert witness in any malpractice action brought against an emergency physician.
After repeated battles with the trial attorneys and committees in both houses, a conference committee of Assembly members and senators was appointed with the aim of striking a compromise on the issue of the emergency physician malpractice standard contained in AB 1301.
The governor wants to see you guys right now on this bill. And I'm going, well, we're right in the middle of this conference committee on these amendments. And I'm, well, I can't go. And so Bill O'Riordan was there and Nat Rose were there. And I said, you guys go with him and you go see the governor. This is Jerry Brown. I raced down to the governor's office wondering, oh my goodness, I wonder what's happened here. And I said, well, how did it go? And so Bill gave us a standard line. Well, we did this. We made this kind of pitch like this. And so Nat Rose, who was this physician who had a great ability to respond to who was in the room, he somehow recognized with the governor that the best thing to do with this governor, because he had these instincts, would be to take him on. And so he said, well, the governor was giving us this line on this bill, and he wasn't going to go for it. So I grabbed him by the tie, and I pulled him up close, and I said, look, Governor, here's what we got to do with this bill. Now, I wasn't in the room. I don't know if this was a true story or not, but Bill O'Riordan, backed him up and said this is what went on in the governor's office. Well, Fazio, who's one of the most skilled politicians you'll ever want to meet, and rose to be number 3 in the House of Representatives before he retired, he talked the governor out of vetoing the bill. So that's just, and that law exists today, and it works wonders today and protects emergency physicians from an unfair standard where a specialist or super specialist tries to say what the standard of care is in emergency departments.
Today's emergency departments see and treat all patients, whether they are insured or uninsured, whether they can pay for their treatment or not. But as ACEP entered its second decade, a rash of patient dumpings, where poor patients received delayed care or none at all due to their inability to pay, became national news. The death of Eugene Barnes would shape national policy and drive ACEP to sponsor legislation that has forever changed emergency care in California.
Patient 0, Eugene Barnes, that occurred in Richmond, California, just across the bay from where I live and practice in Sausalito. He was taken to Brookside Hospital, basically denied access to a neurosurgeon who refused to come in. He then, the emergency doctor there, kind of sweating a little bit of blood, tried to transfer him to Oakland Hospital. They refused. The county hospital in Martinez refused, and finally they transferred Eugene Barnes to San Francisco General Hospital, where Don Trunke, trauma surgeon preeminent in the country, called in the OR crew, and the next thing called the press. So this thing hit the newspapers, made the national news, where Eugene Barnes was denied care because of a lack of an on-call physician.
So that hit the newspapers, and Pete Stark, congressman, got hold of it, and then he ran with it, and a national patient dumping bill was enacted.
After President Reagan signed the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act into law in 1986, which mandated that all emergency care patients be screened and stabilized irrespective of their ability to pay, ACEP looked to craft a law in California that would build upon EMTALA and strengthen it by ensuring emergency care funding while addressing some of the gaps in the national law.
So in 1987, Assemblyman Burt Margolin introduced legislation working with people from Health Access, the ACLU, feeling that the federal law probably was never going to be forcefully applied. So they wanted to set up state regulations.
And in the first year the bill was defeated, hospitals and many were concerned of the cost it would inflict when patients showed up without any ability to pay. And so we put the bill in a second year, and at the same time, ACEP, really Mike Bressler, who was then president or on the executive committee, read in a ACEP publication, I think it was, they passed a fee to add on to moving violations.
I had heard about a law in Virginia where a surcharge was enacted on moving violations, speeding, stop signs, whatever. And they used this money to fund the court system. I thought, aha. Why don't we hijack that principle, that concept, get a law in California, and use that money to fund indigent care in emergency departments?
So he said, well, let's do this in California, Jim. And I said, sounds good to me. And so we put in the bill that would do that. And we got well organized, it did a lot of lobbying on it, and moved it out of the Senate over to the Assembly. In the meanwhile, Margolin moved his patient dumping bill over to the Senate, where they killed it. And so when the Maddie bill came up in Margolin's Health Committee, I suspected, and it was really a wonderful event because we got Margolin to do what we would have asked him to do, but we didn't have to ask him. We got into committee, and sure enough, Margolin said, well, Senator Maddie, We're glad that you're here with this bill and we support this bill, but I had a bill over in the Senate that didn't make it through, and so I'm sure you'll be glad to put the provisions of my bill into your bill. And of course, we were very glad, and we got behind it much more so. Then the bill went back for concurrence and was passed.
Once SB 12 was signed into law by Governor George Deukmejian, Cal-ACEP leadership began to work with ACEP to translate the stronger California law into congressional action.
So I'll never forget Mike Bressler and I, we were down the Cal-ACEP Scientific Assembly in San Bernardino when we got a call from Tom Nichols, ACEP's national lobbyist, and said, gee, you know, Congressman Stark's a little upset because he can't see the whistleblower protection. Well, Mike Bressler is the outgoing president. He had the presidential suite, so he's on the telephone in the bedroom. I'm sitting on the toilet on the telephone, and we are negotiating with Tom Nichols to say, you know, if you take this sentence and this portion and that sentence there, it kind of all, that's what we meant. We meant that we should have whistleblower protections. So that deal was finally, again, with National ACEP, myself, Dr. Bressler negotiated. He was in the bedroom, I was in the John, and in 1989, amendments to EMTALA had both role and responsibility of on-call docs as well as whistleblower protection.
So we were able to, through my experience in Cal-ACEP and the experience that I gathered at the state legislature, able to affect legislation on the federal level through Congress as well. And so I think, again, Cal-ACEP is a tremendous opportunity to learn our legislative process, what goes on in our state, in our country, and to affect things on the state and the national level if we're so inclined. I and many other people who helped on this, Jim Randlett, Larry Bedard, Cal-ACEP, were able to make this difference.
With new and evolving emergency care laws in place, Cal-ACEP spent much of its third decade working to increase emergency care funding and battling with insurance companies and the legislature to end unfair and deceptive practices.
The problem is that the HMOs were using the denial of emergency claims as a way to save money and increase their profits.
They'd have to pay this big, huge bill. So they tried, I believe, to figure out ways to try to avoid paying bills. I mean, I think that's the job of an insurance company, isn't it?